Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you back to Midnight Mumbles. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the tale. But before that, please consider giving us a like and subscribing to our channel. I was the last person to see my brother alive. Today would have been his birthday, his 27th, and lately I haven't been able to get him out of my head. Little Joel, 7 years old forever, because of me, because I couldn't resist my curiosity about those damned woods, that damned house, because I wouldn't go alone. I've replayed the events of that terrible day over and over again, tried to make sense of it. I never told anyone what really happened. I lied. I told them we got separated in the woods and I couldn't find him. That I searched hours until it grew dark and finally went home hoping he was already there. A flimsy story, but they believed it. Certainly, I must have looked haggard enough, exhausted enough for my parents to believe the lie. The police, my family, my neighbors, they combed the woods for weeks hoping to find some trace of him. A scrap of clothing, a shoe, anything. I helped too, though I knew there was no hope, because he wasn't lost. Not in that sense, at least. Something took him. Something that wasn't a man. Something that wasn't an animal either. It could have been me, it found, shivering in that closet on the second floor. Could have been both of us, if we had hidden together. Just dumb luck. That phrase, repeating in my head, just dumb luck, could have been me. Survivor's guilt, I think they call it. I'm writing this. I guess you could call it a confession, out of the dim hope that it will alleviate that guilt somewhat, to finally tell the truth, to tell what really happened. I doubt you'll believe me either. You'll probably just regard it as just another campfire story, something to scare the kids before bedtime. That's okay, you don't have to believe me, but please, would you just listen to my story? The town I grew up in was tiny. Less than 1,000 people lived there, and in the surrounding farms. There was a drugstore where I bought my comics, a Dairy Queen, a couple dusty old shops. Not much else. I was a shy kid, never had many friends. I spent most of my days alone, reading or playing Nintendo. If I was bored, I'd ride my bike around town, although there was never much of anywhere to go, apart from the aforementioned drugstore anyways. When I was about the age of 10, I was fascinated by nature. I would go catching frogs and crawdads under the bridges, read all the books the library had about sharks and wolves, even had a brief flirtation with birdwatching. Nothing compared to the woods, though. Exploring the woods shifted fascination into obsession. I could spend hours in the forest enjoying the silent, green-tinted solitude. As I became familiar with all the landmarks, I began to regard it as a secret place, all my own, but not the deep woods, never alone. I couldn't tell you how deep was too deep exactly, only that after a certain distance from the tree line, when the wheat field where I would leave my bike was completely swallowed by the woods, I would grow uneasy. The solitude became oppressive, and I would go no further. But I wanted to know what lay beyond. My curiosity eventually became too strong to resist, and so I enlisted my brother. Joel was 3 years younger than me, and perhaps my closest friend. I guess he looked up to me, and he seemed eager to see this place I disappeared to nearly every day that summer. I packed my book bag with some bottled water, a couple granola bars I nabbed from the pantry, and 2 flashlights. I stuck a baseball bat in there too, just in case, I told him. The handle protruded from the bag in such a way that I could draw it like a sword. Thought it was pretty cool. My parents were both working at the time, and my older brother was absent as usual. He was nominally in charge of us, but being the outgoing one, he typically left early in the day to hang out with his friends, and so we told no one of our plans. So we hopped on our bikes and pedaled through the field that ran behind the house until we reached the tree line. We dumped them off in my usual spot, and I showed him the narrow tunnel through the weeds that served as the entrance to the woods. He was already a bit nervous, but after a bit of cajoling, we were on our way. We lingered around my woods for a bit. It was an area that amounted to perhaps no more than a 150-yard radius from the entrance. I showed him all my usual haunts, including my favorite landmark, which lay on the outskirts of my comfort zone. It was a pair of broken trees that seemed to spell the word "it." He seemed unusually disturbed by this, which at the time I blamed on my aunt. She didn't care much about what we watched when we visited, and the Stephen King movie was a fairly recent selection. You might remember the fairly disturbing scene where the suicidal Stan scrawled it on the bathroom tile with the blood from his slashed wrists. I could tell he wanted to go back home right then and there, and we hadn't even begun to explore the deep woods yet. I was fairly insistent that we continue, but eventually had to bribe him candy bar I intended for myself. So we hiked on, and it wasn't far beyond that point that we were deeper in the woods than I had ever personally trekked. That feeling of unease and fear still lingered, although I was comforted by my brother's presence and the bat protruding from my backpack. It wasn't the fear of getting lost. We followed a dry creek bed, and following it back would be no challenge. It wasn't the fear of encountering any sort of aggressive wildlife. I had my bat, and in all my time there, I had yet to see an animal larger than a jackrabbit. It was just a sort of vague feeling that I was somewhere I didn't belong. I put it out of my mind, at least as best I could. I was exploring, and I was having fun. I could tell Joel felt the same way, and so I cracked some jokes and sung the songs I knew keep the mood light. It seemed to work pretty well, or at least he wasn't begging for me to take him home. I can't tell you how far we traveled, but we walked that dry creek bed for a couple of hours at least, hopping from stone to stone, chasing bullfrogs, and trying not to bust our asses. Eventually, I nearly forgot my fears entirely, but I kept a careful watch on the sun when I could see it through the trees. I had no desire to be in the deep woods after it set and darkness took hold, flashlight or no. With respect to the oncoming darkness, I judged it was about time to turn back. I turned to brother to say so, and that's when I noticed the house. Set back a short distance away from the creek, it was barely visible through the trees. A gray monolith standing out in the fading light. Puffed up from my own bravery and my damnable curiosity once again piqued, I knew I had to see it up close. I could see that Joel felt no such urge. If he was hesitant to enter the woods, if he was reluctant to continue past the IT tree, he was adamantly against approaching the house. Not that I could blame him, really. That deep in the woods, so far removed from civilization, I could not imagine why or how the house could be there. But it was that very mystery that made the house so compelling to me. I had to unlock its secrets. I tried to coax him into it with all my usual tricks and bribes, promises of bribes to come. He would have none of it. I could see that he was on the verge of tears. He was so frightened of that place. Or perhaps it was a combination of that place, the deepness of the woods, and that old, lingering dread I myself still felt. At that point, I almost dropped the whole thing and just took him home. God, I wish I did. I think of those moments the most, those moments when he wanted to leave, and I forced him to stay with all my big brotherly authority. I hate myself for that, I really do. But as I said, I was curious and overconfident from an afternoon without incident. I knew the sun wouldn't begin to set in earnest for more than an hour, and I thought exploring the house would put a perfect cap on the day. I had to see it. I had to. So like a bastard, I offered him that old big brother ultimatum. I was going, so he could come with me or stay here. If you've ever been a younger brother, you know there's only one answer to that. So he came with me. Just a brief look, I promised. But even that was a lie. We climbed up the creek bed's steep incline, grasping roots and digging our feet into the soft soil. It was slow going, but we managed. Once we were back on level ground, I dusted myself off and looked back toward the house. From that distance, I could see it was not someone's hunting lodge, as I initially suspected, but an old two-story farmhouse. Though it must have been many decades old, it appeared to be standing in reasonably good shape. However, the nearby chicken coop and tiny stable were in shambles, overtaken by newer growth. I ventured towards it, Joel lingering not far behind. The only sounds I recall were the sounds of the leaves picked up by our progress. The bullfrogs and cicadas fell silent here. Even the wind seemed to die as we approached that old house. I could see that some of the windows were still intact, and the door, though obviously rotting, was still more or less on its hinges. Even at that age, I knew that this was a good sign. The house was long abandoned, and not the target of squatters and vandals. This assuaged my fears somewhat, and I urged my brother to continue. He seemed less comforted than I, but was no more willing to be left alone. After some hesitation, he followed me to the front porch. I tested the boards carefully, not eager to fall through and risk injury. They were definitely soft, but solid enough to support my weight. I was a skinny kid. Before trying the door, I drew the bat from my bag and the flashlights. I gave one to Joel, which he promptly switched on. I ignored the fear in his eyes and turned back to the door. It was definitely rotting off the hinges. It gave way without even the trademark haunted house creak. Nearly fell on top of me, as a matter of fact. I caught it and leaned it over against the side of the house, trying my best not to make any noise. The windows afforded the inside of the house a dim but serviceable light, but even so, I switched on my own flashlight for comfort. With my free hand, I held the bat aloft, ready to strike at anything that came leaping out. Nothing did, not then. I stepped inside. The first room was clearly the living room, judging by the fireplace and the old rotting couch. Beyond it was a kitchen, some old utensils laying out on the dusty counter, a wood-burning stove, no fridge. The place looked like it never knew electricity, which was not totally surprising, given its remoteness. The house gave every impression of being long abandoned. There was no garbage, no old food or junkie needles, nothing that gave the suggestion that we weren't the first two souls in the house since time out of mind. I don't know how long I stood there transfixed, taking it in, surely no more than a minute. The spell was broken when I felt something clutch at the hem of my shirt. I let out a gasp that didn't dare turn into a scream and whipped around to face my attacker. It was Joel. I whispered out a chuckle and told him to follow me. It was my intention to find a souvenir, something to take back and prove we were there, and then leave. As fascinating as the place was, and as abandoned as it seemed, it was still very frightening to be there with only my kid brother for company. Peering into the kitchen, I saw nothing of worth, just some rusty old pots and pans. There was a heavy-looking trapdoor, which I judged led to a root cellar. I was certainly not brave enough to face that place, so I turned my attention elsewhere. Adjacent to the living room was a narrow hall. Here there were 2 tiny bedrooms, both with no door, and bereft of anything more than the remains of a bed, covered with a filthy, dirt-encrusted mattress. No souvenirs here. From the window, I could see that the sun was setting fast. It was summertime, though, and I knew we could return much faster than we arrived. Just one more thing to see. Upstairs. At the end of the hall, I found the stairs. The staircase was narrow, but the stairs themselves seemed solid enough. I tested each one carefully. They creaked and groaned, but none of them seemed weak enough to give. At the halfway point, I motioned to Joel to follow me. His flashlight was pointed toward his face, and I could see he was crying silently. Still, though, he followed me. I was afraid too. There was something about that place gave me the creeps. I couldn't place it at the time. I can't say what it was that stopped me from turning back then, leaving that place. Maybe if I did, maybe if I decided we should leave at that moment, Joel would still be alive. But I didn't. I had to see the top floor. The stairs ended on a narrow landing leading to the master bedroom. I waited there for Joel to catch up. From there, I could see that the master bedroom was nearly as bare as the rest of the house. There was a bed, a wardrobe, a table, and a chair. There was a small object laying on the table. "Let's get out of here," Joel whispered from behind me. "Just a second," I hissed, throwing him an irritated look. As I stepped into the bedroom, see the object on the table was a book. It looked old, but relatively undamaged from the elements. It was bound in leather and looked handmade. There was no title on the cover. I thought it must have been some kind of journal, and it seemed like the perfect souvenir to leave with. That was my intention. I would grab the book, and we would hot-foot it home. I reached out and touched the book, ran my fingers across the cover, and felt the grain of the leather. It felt odd, warm and greasy, like it was sweating. I took this to mean the book was rotting away, like the rest of the house. But it was then, just as I was about to pick the book up and stuff it in my backpack, that's when I heard the sound. It was a long, sustained creaking sound, the sort I expected from the front door, followed by an echoing slam, the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. I froze in place, the book momentarily forgotten. It could only have been the cellar door. I turned to Joel and put my finger to my lips, hoping the urgency in my expression be enough to keep him from crying out. For a moment, all was silent, almost long enough to dismiss the sound. Almost. Just as I was nearly ready to make a run for it, I heard another sound, a wet slap, faint but audible in the silence. Another. Footsteps, it must have been, but it sounded wrong. Whatever it was, it must have known we were there. Every wet slap sounded closer than the last. It must have been in the hall now. I turned back to Joel and mouthed a single word. "Hide." He took my advice and ducked into the wardrobe. I could see there was only room enough for one in there, so I took the closet. Like the rest of the house, there was no door. It was shadowy enough to hide in, though, so I crouched as far back into it as I could. My plan, inasmuch as I had one, was to wait for whoever it was to come into the room and hit them in the back of the head with the bat when their back was turned. Then I would yank Joel out of the wardrobe and we'd make a run for it. I clutched the bat to my chest and waited. It was at the stairs now. Another wet slap, then a creak as it put its weight down. One after another, it was a wonder it never broke through. Whatever it was, it sounded much heavier than my brother or me. Closer and closer it came, until I could hear it breathing. It was a sickly sound, wet and bubbling like someone dying of pneumonia. Then came the smell. God, it was horrible. I've never smelled anything as bad as that thing smelled. Words fail to describe it. There was the rotten egg smell of sulfur, sharp and pungent, but that wasn't all of it, not by far. It smelled of rot and of excrement. When I was younger, we lived in a house with a storm cellar where small animals would get trapped and die. That punky, sweet, gritty reek of decay was heavy there, unbearable. Even so, it was nothing compared to this, and it got worse with every step. My eyes watered, my vision blurred. Not enough though, because I could still see it when it stepped into the room. The first thing I saw was the black mist, like a dark fog so thick with water vapor that it was turning again into rain. Whatever it was, it surrounded the creature like a coil, dripping and pooling on the floor. Where it fell, it sizzled against the floor, disappeared, leaving only a singed mark on the boards. Then I could see its head, if you could call it that. It was something like a horse skull, at least as I remember it, bits of flesh still clinging to the bone. The black vapor hung around it in a dank miasma. It walked on two legs, more or less upright, like a man but hunched over. It had long arms that nearly dragged the ground. The flesh that clung to it was gangrenous and rotting. I couldn't see its body for the mist that clung to it. The footprints that trailed behind it, long and terribly unnatural, were black and hissed caustically in the weathered old floorboards. I was raised Christian, and I was certain then that I was looking at the devil himself. No red-suited, fork-tailed imp could have been so bad as this. Somehow I managed not to cry out in terror. Its wet, croupy breathing grew heavier as it entered the room, searching from side to side. I shrunk back into the closet as far as I could go, hugging the bat to my chest so hard it left a mark that lingered for days afterward. My plan was forgotten. I only prayed it wouldn't find us and would return to the hell it came from. My prayers were not answered. I heard another sound, barely audible over the creature's breathing, a soft whimper, a cry of fright. It was Joel. I saw the thing tilt its head to the side, listening. The wardrobe he knew. While I shivered in the dark, unable to run or even to move, it tore the door off its hinges effortlessly. My brother shrieked when he saw the thing, mad with fear. He shrieked louder still, as it took him in its great spindly arms and threw him over its shoulder. I heard a hissing sound, and a new odor hit my nose, the smell of my brother's skin burning. Whatever that black mist was, it was eating him alive. His skin bubbled and melted at its touch. As the thing turned to leave, apparently satisfied, my brother turned and looked my way. I don't know if he could see me there in the darkness, but the last time I saw my brother alive, he was pleading with his eyes, pleading for me to do something, anything, but I couldn't. I was his big brother. I was supposed to protect him, but I did nothing. I only hid in that closet, listening to his screams as the thing took him away. I hid there until my brother's screams were cut off with the sound of that cellar door slamming back shut. After that, there was nothing. Silence prevailed again. Eventually, my fear broke, and I sprung out of that closet and ran. I ran down the stairs, down the hall, into the living room. I ran out the door, not even daring to look back into that kitchen. Thankfully, I only had to follow the creek back home, and so I didn't get lost in my fear. I ran as fast as my legs would carry me, not even pausing to turn my flashlight on. I ran in the light of the moon. Somehow, I managed to keep my footing on those mossy old stones and never fell like in those cheesy old movies. Eventually, I found myself in a familiar area heralded by the IT trees. From there, I knew somehow I was home free. I slackened my pace somewhat, but still, I would not look back. I knew that if I did, that terrible thing would be right behind me, breathing its terrible breath down my neck. So I pressed on until I found the entrance, and from there, my bike. I mounted it and pedaled as fast as my exhausted legs could manage it. I didn't slow down until I was in the door, immediately confronted by my parents. They were both nearly panic-stricken, demanding explanations. I knew they would never believe me, but my biggest fear was if I told them about the house, they would want to see it, and I couldn't go back there. Not then, not ever. I never told anyone about the house, and if anyone in the search party found it, they made no mention of it or that strange book. For myself, I joined in the search party only as much as I thought was necessary, only by day and never alone. After it was done, I never set foot in another forest, and I never would, except I know there's only one way I can assuage my guilt. I've been thinking about it for these last few weeks, mostly in the early hours of the morning when I'd awaken from my nightmares, stifling screams to avoid waking my girlfriend. With growing certainty, I know what I have to do. I have to go back. I have to find that house in the woods. I have to find that book and see what secrets it holds. I have to confront that thing in the cellar once and for all. Perhaps I'll find the house burned to the ground, taken by lightning, and the cellar swallowed up by the earth. It's been years. Maybe I'll return and find that land has been developed, a mini mall or an apartment block put up in its place. But somehow, I doubt it. Whatever happened there before the place was abandoned, whatever happened to the people who lived there, whatever it was, made it a shunned place. And anyone foolish enough to set foot there was damned. I think of the forces that drew me there the first time. I blamed it on childish curiosity, but I can feel it pulling me there again. God damn it, it's pulling me there again. The following is the transcript of an interview held by the Collier Police Department. Police. This interview is being tape recorded. I am Officer Redacted of the Collier Police Department. Mom, would you please state your full name for the record? SG. My name? I just told you. Police. This is for the record, Mom. Please just state your full name. SG. Size. My name is Sarah Lindsay Gamble. What is the point of this? I told you, he's dead. I just want to make sure his parents know. I don't want. Police. Ma'am? Ma'am? Please, we just need a complete statement for the record. All you have told us so far is that he is dead. We need to know who he is and what is your connection to him. Can you do that for me, Ma'am? SG. Please stop calling me Mom. You sound like one of my students. I'm an elementary school teacher. 4th grade. Call me Sarah. Police. Okay, Sarah. Now will you tell us the name of the deceased and explain your relationship to him? SG. Yes. His name is His, his name was James Wagner. I'm his girlfriend. Well, fiance. We live together. Expletive deleted. It's hard, you know. I guess I'm gonna have to get used to referring to James in past tense. Please. It's okay. Please. Go on. SG. We shared an apartment in Breckenridge. The address is redacted. For the record, it's about 200 miles from here. Police. And how long have you two been cohabiting? That is to say, how long? SG. I know what cohabiting means. I'm a school teacher. Sorry. I didn't mean to snap at you. I'm just... 2 years. We'd been living together for 2 years. In August. Police. Okay, and what was the purpose of your visit to the town of Collier, Sarah? SG. Look, could I maybe have a cigarette? I quit last year, but I just really need a cigarette right now. Police. I'm afraid this station is smoke-free, Miss Gamble. SG. Expletive deleted. Sorry. It's fine. It's a bad habit anyway. Look, I'll tell you everything, but I want to make something clear. All right? Police. Certainly. SG. This statement, it's not a confession. All right? I didn't kill my boyfriend. This isn't my fault. If I have any responsibility for his death, it's because I didn't believe his story. I didn't take him seriously. I shouldn't have let him return to that expletive, deleted, terrible house in the woods. But how could I have known? How could anyone believe something like that? Police. Miss Gamble, Sarah, would you prefer to make your statement in the presence of your attorney? You have that right. And any time you want to stop this interview for that purpose, it stops. SG. I don't have a... No, sir. I don't need a lawyer. There's no point. Police. Very well. Now, could you tell us what happened, starting from the beginning? SG. Okay. Sighs. The story, or at least my part of the story, began 2 days ago at about 3:30 in the morning. I awoke in the bed I shared with him, feeling the need to urinate, and I got up, taking care not to wake him in the process. He had always been a light sleeper. Lately, his insomnia had been acting up, so any sleep he could get, well, I wouldn't want to interrupt that. Police. Apart from insomnia, had you noticed any other changes in Mr. Wagner's behavior or mental state? SG. I'm his girlfriend. I'm closer to him than anyone else on earth. Was closer. Whatever. He'd always suffered from depression, or at least he had as long as I had known him. But like a lot of people who suffer from depression, he learned ways to cope with it. Sometimes, like if you didn't know him like I knew him, you couldn't even tell. He could be a fun guy. People liked him. Police. If we could get back to the events in question. SG. Hold on, damn it. I'm getting to it. I'm sorry. I know you're just doing your job. I keep blowing up on you. It's expletive deleted. Please. It's okay, Sarah. Go on. In your own words. SG. All right. Can I get a glass of water? Throat's dry. Please, sure. Intercom. Can I get a glass of water in here? Voice, sure. Redacted, 1 sec. SG, thanks. Pause. Door opens. Thank you. Sips. Door closes. Please. You were talking about Mr. Wagner's mental state. SG, yeah. I was going to say he had always been depressed, but over the past few weeks, I had noticed a steep increase in his symptoms. Police. Do you believe he was suicidal in this time? SG, no. Maybe. I'm not sure. But he was in a bad way. He couldn't work. Could barely leave the house. I had to force him to sometimes. Most of the time, he just sat there with a faraway look in his eyes. Like he was thinking about something, I guess. The first thing I noticed was his nightmares. He denied ever having them, but you know, it wasn't the sort of thing you could hide from the person who slept in the same bed with you. Night after night. He would thrash, he would moan, He would kind of talk in his sleep. Nothing I could make out. Usually, he would wake up gasping. Police, did the two of you ever discuss his troubles? SG. No. I tried to sit down with him and talk about things, but I never could get him to own up to anything. I guess he thought he could hide it from me, that I wouldn't know, that it would pass, and he would eventually return to his old self again. I guess I thought that too, for a while. Police, what changed that? SG. The night in question changed that. I guess. It was only by chance that I gained the insight I now have into his troubles. Plan was to just sort of disappear from my life. That's what I figured when I found what he had left for me. Police, what did he leave you? SG, a note. Or a confession, maybe you would call it. I found it on the way back to bed. I had decided to grab a drink of water first, so I detoured into the kitchen. That's where I noticed the stack of paper, which had not been there when I had gone to bed, on the counter. I might have gone to bed without giving it a second look, and perhaps that would have been better. I guess you never know how things might have turned out differently. You could drive yourself crazy thinking about the possibilities. You know, would it have been better or worse being left to wonder what had become of him? Long pause. It's irrelevant, I suppose. What happened happened. Nothing is going to change that. I just wish I had stopped him, that's all. Police. What did the note say? SG. He never spoke of his brother, really. He told me once that Joel had died, but he wouldn't say anything else about it. In fact, he seldom spoke of his childhood at all. The story he detailed in that stack of papers provided the clearest glimpse I had ever had to his past. In the story, he talked about the woods he would explore as a child. He said he sort of coerced his brother into following him deeper into the woods. Deeper than he had gone before, I mean. He said they found a house in the woods, and that while inside, a demon came up from the cellar and took poor Joel away. Said Joel stared at him while the awful thing's poisons ate away at him. As the thing carried him away, he said something about how the guilt was eating him alive, that he had to go back to that place and, I don't know, set things right. Or maybe he didn't know why. Police, did you believe his story? SG. No, of course not, but I didn't think he was making it up either. Not exactly. Not intentionally, I guess is what I mean. It was clear, the way he had been acting, and the pain, the agony that shone through every line of that story, it would have been inconceivable that he would channel that sort of grief into a campfire story, you know? Police. So what did you think? SG. At first, I didn't know what to think. It scared the hell out of me, I can tell you that. But I couldn't make sense of it. I sat there in the kitchen reading the story over and over again, until finally I thought I had it figured out. I played armchair psychiatrist, and it cost James his life. That's what I believe. That's what I know now. Joel, I decided, had simply gotten lost somewhere in those woods. Maybe he fled from the house, if indeed there even ever was a house, and fallen victim to a nasty fall or a wild animal. Something like that. James would have felt responsible for Joel's death, and over the span of 20 years or so, he externalized that guilt into a scapegoat, this demon. It's the only thing that made sense to me. Police. So what did you do? SG. Well, I thought that if I somehow prevented him, or forbade him from returning to the woods, that wouldn't fix anything. You have to understand, he was a mess. You could see he was well on his way to a breakdown, and a bad one. I figured if he went to the house, and confronted his fears like he planned. He would see what really happened that day, and he could move on from it. Like I said, armchair psychiatrist. The only change I intended to make was that I would accompany him on this journey. I had to be there to catch him when he fell, so to speak. Police. And how did you convince him to bring you along? SG. Laughs. Clears throat. I'm his girlfriend. I'm a woman. That's what we do. We win arguments. I crept back in bed and waited, wide awake, for him to try to sneak out. I passed the time preparing all my gambits for the fight to come. In another hour, James rose without the aid of an alarm and began the process of surreptitiously preparing for his departure. I confronted him, having never fallen back asleep, already dressed and ready to present my case. Predictably, he was resistant to the idea of my tagging along, but his battle was lost before it began. He was doomed by his failure to creep out while I slumbered, really. I dug my heels in and budged not an inch. Finally, he agreed to let me come along, under 3 conditions. Police. And what were these conditions? SG. 1. If he told me to run, I must run immediately and without argument. 2. When it came time to enter the cellar, he would do so alone. 3. If he did not emerge from the cellar in the space of a half hour, I was to leave and presume him dead. I agreed to his terms, but intended to follow my own instincts in the moment. Naturally. Shortly thereafter, we were on the road. James said little. He seemed lost in thought and deeply troubled. At first, I took his expression to be one of sorrow or of introspection, but as the miles unrolled beneath us, I realized the truth. He was terrified. I cannot imagine the will it would take a person to confront the source of decades of horror and grief, and to do so knowing no way to overcome that terrible thing. I couldn't imagine it then, that strength of will, and less so now that I know the truth. Police. Which is what exactly? SG. Please, officer, let me get there in my own way. I know it's important that you know what happened, all the details, but I want to forget, and this is hard for me. Telling the story again, reliving, sob. Police. Do you need to take a break? SG, no. Sniffs. No, thank you. I just need to tell it. Have it done with. Then you're going to tell his mother, right? Police. Right. In your own time, Sarah, please. SG. Sniffs. We arrived at our destination just short of 11:30 in the morning. Collier. Here. He grew up here. That's what he said. His family, they left somewhere between 15 and 20 years ago. Probably closer to 20. They didn't want to stick around after Joel. You know, we stopped at that gas station, Kathy's, when we got into town, ate a slice of pizza, had a bottle of water, just a bite before heading into the woods. I figured at that point the woods would be leveled. They weren't. Police. Where are these woods located? SG. I didn't get a really good idea of the geography coming through. We came in on the north side by way of, I think it's Highway 75? Police. That's right. SG. Right, so we crossed through town until we got to 11th Lane. That's the street he lived on. The house he grew up in wasn't there anymore. Just an empty, weedy lot. Maybe it burned down, or maybe got torn down. There was a bit of foundation there. That was it. The driveway was sort of overgrown, but it was still there. That's where we parked. There's some other houses on the street, but they were sort of far away. The lot was bordered on every side by fields. Farmland. I guess you would know. You live here. Police. Right. And the woods? SG. Still there. I could see them from the lot, a long field away. We stood there for a minute, staring across the way. He told me he used to call that forest the field. Because of the field, you had to cross to reach it. He didn't say much else. After a while, he started walking, and I had to follow him. But I'll tell you something that made no sense to me at the time. Police. What is that? SG. I hated those woods. I never felt that way about a place before in my entire life. They were a quarter-mile away, and I felt at that moment I had no business taking one step closer. But I did. I promised I would help James through this thing, and I meant to keep my promise. James's story spoke of a sort of turning point, a place where he and Joel could have fled, and maybe everything still could have been okay. I think that moment was my turning point. If I would have listened to my instinct and just dragged James kicking and screaming back home, done the thing I should have done in the first place, and gotten him to therapy, I guess he would still be here. That's what I believe. Instead, I followed him. We walked across the field in silence, under the blazing sun. It's funny. Well, not funny, but, well, you know. I told myself that nothing that bad could happen in the middle of the day. Even in James's story, nothing bad happened until after the sun went down. That wouldn't happen for hours. I was still scared, but in some sort of superstitious and utterly unspoken way, I felt like I was safe under the sun. Isn't that stupid? Police. It isn't stupid at all. Mankind has felt that way since the beginning of time. It's not stupid, SG. Thanks. So eventually, we reached the end of the field and sort of followed the tree line for a ways. He stopped at a spot that looked at first more or less like any other spot to me, but he said it was the entrance. It had just grown over a bit, so we trudged through the thick weeds, and I prayed I wouldn't step on a rattlesnake or something, some kind of snake. I didn't though, and it wasn't long before we reached the edge of the creek. The weeds were thinner, the shade of the trees. It was a sort of steep drop, and being the later part of the summer, that creek was bone dry. Standing on the edge, James pointed off to the left, where I saw the rusted remains of a car. The grime was so thick on the windows, you couldn't see inside at all. He told me that in all the times he had explored these woods, he never had the courage to look inside. He was sure he would find a dead body. He figured, much as I did, that the car had just broken down for the last time at some point, and its owner had simply abandoned it there. Police. Can you identify the make and model of the car? SG. No, I think it was a Chrysler, but I wouldn't swear to that. I guess you'll see it when you guys go down there. It's the only dumped car I saw along the way. So as I was saying, we stood there at the edge for a second, looking down and thinking about the drop. I was going to suggest we find an easier way down, but James just sort of scrambled down the slope, stumbled over a rock, and jumped back to his feet, no worse for wear. I was scared, but he just sort of helped me down, holding on to my feet, and I made it without breaking my neck, or even busting my ass. Police. And did you find the house? SG. Eventually. I don't think it was very far as the crow flies, but the riverbed was full of twists and turns, and seemed to be made up entirely of huge, slick, moss-covered rocks, and deep, shoe-stealing mud pits. And mosquitoes. God, there were so many mosquitoes. I must be covered in bites. My own fault, I guess, for not bringing any bug spray. I guess all in all, it took 2 hours or so to reach the house. Still only mid-afternoon, so that was okay. Another grueling scramble up the riverbank, and we were standing in the yard. It might have been 3 o'clock. Police. Could you describe the house? SG. Sure. It was 2 stories tall, sort of a grayish no color that may have decades ago been white. It was ugly, blocky, 1 step above clapboard really. Kinda big, not too big. Bigger than you would think, I guess you might say. It had a front porch that was saggy but not collapsed, and the windows still had glass in them, which I considered to be a minor miracle. It looked old, but it wasn't falling apart. Not really. You could tell no one was taking care of it. The door was hanging off its hinges, which I remembered from James's story. It fell off the hinges when they tried to open it. We stood there for several minutes, I guess waiting for James to summon the courage to step inside. Staring up at the house, I believed irrationally, though wholeheartedly, that the house was the source of my fear of those tainted woods, that it sort of radiated some kind of malice. I thought it was irrational then. I don't know. Police. Did you go into the house? SG. Yeah. Finally, James said something like, "It's still here." I think that's what he said. He was sort of saying it to himself. I got the impression he forgot I was there. He didn't look okay. His skin looked sort of gray, like the house. He was sweating, but it didn't seem like it was from the heat. He sort of jerked forward, like he had to force himself to start moving. I followed him. Police. Did it seem like the house was occupied? SG. No, not at all. It was exactly as he described in his story. There was some nasty old furniture, a stove, stuff like that. Other than that, it was empty. In fact, and this to me was the damnedest thing, it didn't even seem like animals had been in there. I didn't even see any spider webs. Can you believe that? Police. Old abandoned house open to the elements? Not hardly. I'd expect spider webs, mud dauber nests, mice, you name it. SG. There was nothing like that. Nothing at all. Oh, it was old, yeah. It was dirty. The ceiling sagged. The couch was rotting. But as for signs of life, me and James, that's it. And I would have staked my life on it. And I think I knew why, because I felt it ringing out in every nerve in my body. We shouldn't have been there. Nothing should have. Animals felt it, and they stayed far. The expletive deleted away. I think I was crying the entire time we were in there. An empty house, middle of the day, no one there but me and my boyfriend, and I was terrified. James walked straight into the kitchen and crouched down, looking at something. I followed him in there so I could see. Police. What was it? SG. The cellar door. That was where he said the demon took his brother. I thought of him going down there, leaving me alone. I begged him not to do it. I begged him to take me home, forget about all of this. I wasn't playing armchair psychiatrist anymore. I didn't care a bit about confronting fears or anything like that. I wanted to run away, but I couldn't leave him behind. I wouldn't. He didn't listen, of course. He wouldn't even answer me. He just told me to stand back, and he repeated his command to leave if he was gone for more than half an hour. He had his hands on the knotted bit of rope that served for a handle, and he glared at me until I stepped far back into the living room. When I was finally far enough away for him, he took a deep breath, lifted the door, and descended. He closed the door behind him, and it slammed shut. It sounded so final. For the next several minutes, I just sat there, sobbing and staring into the kitchen. I guess I was still holding out hope that the only thing he'd find down there was some old dusty mason jars or some firewood from 50 years ago. Maybe then he would understand that his brother's death wasn't his fault and we could go home. Police. What happened? SG. At first, nothing. He didn't run out of there. I didn't hear any screams. No bat out of hell came flying out of there. Nothing. I just sat there with my sobs slowly tapering off. I could hear the cicadas outside, making that weird call of theirs. I guess after a while, I decided I was just letting my imagination run wild with me. James was just sitting down there in the dirt, coming to terms with things, and he'd be out any moment. Well, he didn't. I guess I sat there for about 30 minutes, just sort of chewing my fingernails and waiting for something to happen. When nothing kept happening, I decided it wouldn't hurt anything to stretch my legs and have a look around. That's what I told myself I was doing, but it wasn't true. Police. Chair shifts. So what were you doing? SG. I was looking for the book. That was a detail from James's story that my mind just kept coming back to. I guess I didn't mention it before. Police. How does a book tie into this? SG. James found it in the upstairs bedroom. It was the only thing in the house that stood out to him. He was going to take it for a souvenir, but he had no more than laid his hand on it when he heard the cellar door open. The story made no more mention of it, so I assumed it was still there. I guess I was just curious. I wanted to know what it had to say. Assuming it said anything. Police. Did you find it? SG. Long silence. Yeah, I found it. Listen, officer. Officer. Police. Redacted. SG. Officer. Redacted. Sure. You've been... Well, I'm not sure kind is the right word, but you've been decent enough to listen to what I have to say. I know when I got here, I was kind of a mess, screaming and, well, I don't really remember too well. I'm sure you have to think that I went nuts, that I killed James, and you're just waiting for me to tell you how I did it. I know there's no way you'll be able to believe what I'm about to tell you, and I just want you to know that's okay. I've got to tell someone. Police. I tell you what, Sarah, just tell your story, and I'll figure out what I think from there. SG. Ragged breath. Okay. Right. So I started climbing up the stairs, and that's when I saw them. The footprints, I mean. James said that wherever the demon stepped, he would leave charred footprints on the wood. The dust on the floor was so thick, I almost couldn't see them, but they were there. Black marks, shaped like some kind of foot. Not a human foot, and they were big. The top floor was nothing more than a landing, and the bedroom, and I could see it was just as James had said. There was a closet next to the doorway. That must have been where James had hidden. Straight across from the doorway was the wardrobe. Its door had been ripped off and thrown to the side. That's where Joel was hiding when the thing found him. The book was on a table next to the bed, and I noticed it was the only thing in the house that wasn't coated with an inch-thick layer of dust. I reached out to the book, but I hesitated. James didn't come right out and say so, but it seemed like touching the book had sort of triggered the thing's arrival. I could be doing the same thing. I agonized over it for a couple of minutes, but in the end, I just wasn't far enough over the deep end to really believe that could be true. So I picked up the book, Police, and SG. Well, I didn't hear anything. No trapdoor slamming open, no unearthly scream, no clap of thunder, like in a cheap horror film. Nothing. Still, I almost dropped the book straight away. It felt disgusting. It felt like I was holding a dead animal or something. It made me feel unclean. I set it back on the table, but I didn't leave it alone. I started looking through it. Police, what did it say? SG at first. It was just a journal. I guess it belonged to the original owner. He and his family lived here in the mid-60s. Not exactly pioneer days, but they were living rough. Small farm patch. They raised chickens, couple of goats. He said he used to work at a factory in town, but he had a dream. He dreamed he was supposed to build this house in this spot and live there with his family. Said an angel showed him the place. The next several pages I just sort of skimmed over. It was all a lot of day-to-day descriptions of their life in the old house, the farming, raising the kids, that sort of thing. They were very religious, and I got the impression he was waiting for another sign from God. Well, he got it, or at least he thought he did. Police. How so? SG. His wife wanted a root cellar so they could keep preserves, so he set about digging her one. Well, he got it just about as deep as he wanted it when he struck stone, masonry. There was a stone floor under the house, you see, a man-made structure. That night, he had another dream. In this dream, the angel told him God had for him a test of faith. First, he would have to completely uncover the slab, clear it of dirt. After that, the angel instructed him to make a sacrifice of all his livestock. He was to take the blood of the goats and the chickens, and with it draw on the stone floor a certain symbol, which the angel would reveal unto him. The angel told him that if his faith was true, and if he followed God's commandment, then the Lord would bless his family forevermore with good health, love, and plenty. I'm quoting a lot here. Police. Did he do it? SG. Yes, he did. But if the Lord blessed him, he made no mention of it in his journals. The next entry was his final entry. It seems that after he painted the symbol on the floor, he was visited by the angel one last time in a vision more powerful than any that came before it. The angel told him to gather his family together at dusk and lead them into the cellar, where the Lord would shine down his countenance and bestow upon them his blessing. That's more or less what it said. Police. And there was nothing else in the journal after that? SG. Not quite. On the last page was, I think it was the symbol. It was a circle with a circle within it. The inner circle was crisscrossed with lines and bordered with little runes, or letters, or something. I stared at it, and all of a sudden, my vision went red. I passed out. Police. You fainted? How long were you out? SG. A while. A long while. When I came to, the sun was setting. It must have been hours. Immediately, I went into a panic. Because of James, He was still down there. I left the book behind and scrambled down the stairs, fishing the flashlight out of my bag as I went. I was lucky I didn't bust through the stairs, break my neck. I guess I was lucky for that. I ran straight for the trapdoor and threw it open before my brain could catch up and try to stop me. I hit the bottom of the stairs and finally I took a breath. That's when the smell hit me. Nothing could have prepared me for it. That reek, that unclean open grave, maggot, writhing, feculent stench. It was the stench of the pit. And at the bottom of those steps, I reeled, retching, at the gates of hell. Police. Did you find James? SG. Long pause. Yes. And he was still alive then. They wanted me to watch, you see? Police. Who did? SG. There were so many of them. Dozens. Huge, emaciated, ragged, corpse-like things. They weren't all just like the one James described, but they all swarmed with that dreadful black miasma, that swirling caustic vapor that ate Joel alive. And they weren't human. Were never human. The room was illuminated by this terrible swamp light. It came from them somehow. They were staring at me, waiting. Police. You're telling me the basement was full of SG, demons, or if they weren't demons exactly, There was something so close as to make the distinction irrelevant. And James, he was in the center of them all, pegged to the floor and stripped naked. It looked like some kind of sick parody of Christ, pierced through the hands and feet. You know, stakes, right in the center of that symbol. His face, his skin was burned all over. He was bleeding from a dozen places, but, sobs, police. It's okay, Sarah, you don't have to. SG, he was aware. He could see me. He knew what was happening. I think he was trying to scream at me, tell me to run away, but they had taken his tongue, pulled out his teeth. They must have spent hours tormenting him, while I just sat up there, waiting for him to come out. I couldn't move. I couldn't run away. I was just like a frightened animal. It was all too big to process. Finally, as if by some unheard signal, those damn things, they converged on James. I listened to him scream and scream until I guess my mind finally sort of snapped. I don't remember anything until yesterday, when you found me wandering the streets. That's the whole story, I guess. Police. Long pause. Sarah, let's say these demons were real, assuming that is possible. Have you considered the question of why they would let you leave? Why didn't they take you too? SG. At first, I couldn't figure that out either. It didn't make sense to me until I found this in my pocket. Sound of paper unfolding. Police. Is that the SG symbol? Yes. I must have taken it from the journal before I left. When I looked at it, I knew. The understanding, it just sort of came into me. Those things down there, they were still tethered to the stone, to the house. So they needed me to bring this to you. You had to witness the symbol. Not you, exactly. Just someone away from the house. Someone in a populated area. They needed a witness, and cries out sobs. You have to understand, officer. I didn't want this. I just wanted to. I've got to do this. They needed a witness and a sacrifice. I've got to police. What do you mean, a sac? What is that? She has a razor. She hid a razor in her hair. Sarah. No. Don't. Sound of a struggle. Recording device hits the floor. Redacted. Call an ambulance. She just slit her own. Loud rumbling. Unidentified sounds. Shouts. Screams. Tape ends.